Welcome to the Extinction Level Event Podcast, Apocalypse Edition. I am your host, The Barrelman. So, this is episode 1, if you will. I don't know if we're really going to stick to numbering the episodes or not. It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. Sometimes it's what episode it is per season. We'll figure it out. I don't even know how long it's going to go or how well it's going to do. So, let us just move on. So what are we doing here? What is this particular episode? Well, this episode is just kind of a preview. It's a bit of an extended trailer, if you will. We're not going to get into anything like we would into a normal episode. Most of those are going to be based on specific events or clusters of events that are going on. Trust me, there's always some of those that we can look up and do a show on. That just doesn't happen to be what we're doing today. Today is going to be more of a preview, so we're going to, in general, go over a lot of things and talk about them, so you have some idea of what kind of things we're going to talk about and the view and take that we have on those topics. So, let's start off at a bit of a broad and narrow it down a little bit by starting with what is the greenhouse effect. This is the thing everybody's talking about. This is the thing that's going to make Earth hot, right? Greenhouse make Earth hot? Right. That's what we're going to talk about right now. So the greenhouse effect is essentially... So first, I guess we got to talk about the way light works. And not on a fundamental quantum level, but we're going to talk about it as far as how it heats the Earth and in general what's going on, because it's really kind of necessary to understand how the greenhouse effect is changing that or altering or however you want to look at it. So the way it works is light, which comes in the form of photons. I know we weren't going to get all quantum, but it's important. Photons, which are basically little particles that act both as particles and as waves. We will probably get into that at some point. We're not going to right now. Like I said, this is more of a general preview. So it acts a bit as, anyways. The point is that these little particles have energy. And so when they hit the Earth, they impart some of that energy. And then, of course, they bounce off. Their energy isn't spent, but some of the energy has been imparted to the Earth. We see that as light. That is why you can see anything, and it is not 100% pitch black here on this planet. Now, some might say, yeah, well, we still have the other stars, and it wouldn't really kill. They might say, well, the moon and the planet, yeah, the light from those is coming from our sun. It's bouncing off, so we wouldn't get that. But we could get some light from the other stars and stuff if we didn't have a star there. So it's true, probably wouldn't be pitch black, but it would be pretty damn close. But the point is, the fact that we aren't pretty close to pitch black and we can actually see in front of our face is 100% due to our sun, right? Whether it's bouncing off the moon, Jupiter, whatever. That's why we see things. And it's not just because it's light out. That's literally how we see things. Because you don't actually see the chair or whatever that's in front of you. The fact is you see the light bouncing off that object. It hits your retinas, registers in your brain, blah, blah, blah. I said we weren't going to get that deep into this kind of stuff, and we're not. So I'll jump out of that rabbit hole. The point is that little bit of energy that's imparted to the Earth, the light then bounces away from. So then it's a matter of, well, how much of that energy bounces away? So we won't get into the math and all that on that. That could also be a future episode or a future part of an episode. Suffice it to say that it isn't 100% of the energy, otherwise they'd be spent. Obviously they bounce off and they go other places. They still have energy in them. Now, if light hits an object, it's going to impart some energy. If it hits water, it's going to impart some energy. And it will flow through the water. As we know, light does penetrate water. By the time it gets to the bottom, it has spent all of its energy. That's why there's no light at the bottom, because those photons have spent their energy. Why is this important? Well, because what's happening is that light isn't just hitting the water and then going through. It's a nanoparticle, smaller. It's a subatomic particle. There we go. That's more correct. Light is a subatomic particle, and it's hitting all the subatomic particles that water is made of, and the things in the water. So it's imparting that light and heat energy to all of those particles until it's spent. It isn't simply that it's hitting one object and just kind of fading out. That is important because when it bounces off, it's also hitting all the particles in the atmosphere, of course, but it does that anyways, and then it flows up into the atmosphere again, hitting all those particles again, and then escaping. And it does impart that energy. However, if we were to trap that and get it to bounce off of something and back to the Earth, it would impart more energy into the Earth, making it even warmer. It doesn't really make it lighter because our eyes don't notice the amount of increase of light that it imparts. Technically, would make it a little bit lighter because some of that energy is coming off of the light. Most of it comes off as heat because most energy byproduct is going to be heat. That's just thermodynamics. So that light, what happens is it hits the ground and then wants to bounce up into space. This is, I know, a little ways to get to, but the point is the greenhouse effect, and that's why it's important. Again, we can go over more of this later, but it's important to understand the fundamentals so we can even have the discussion moving forward, and some of these other things play into this as well. So just having that basic information is how we're going to be able to proceed even through this, basic entry-level episode that we're doing here. So, if that light bounces off of something else, and I know I'm probably already lost a bunch of people like, oh man, I don't want to hear all this tech. We're not going to stay on the tech. I mean, we'll do even the regular episodes. We're not going to stay on the technical stuff. We're going to get into some technical stuff, but that's not the point. The point isn't to bog you down in technical jargon and science and all that. The point is to get the facts across and for you to understand what's being said and know why. So that's really the whole point of it. And again, this plays in the whole rest of the podcast, just getting this little bit of information out. So I promise we're going to get past most of the technical stuff, and we're not going to talk a ton about it moving forward. So as I was saying, if that light encounters another surface or reason to bounce back, it's going to impart more energy, and that means more heat, because again, most energy comes off as heat most of the time, right? So if it does that, the Earth's going to be even warmer, and that light basically stays here instead of escapes back into Earth. It's always going to make the Earth warm, because that's how Earth works, right? But if it makes it warmer and warmer, then Earth maybe not work so good. Not for, living creatures anyways. So when we have a layer of particles, like, for example, carbon dioxide, it's then going to bounce off of that and come back down, hit the Earth, and impart even more heat. And obviously there are particles that do better at this than others. Carbon dioxide's a really good one. Methane's even better at it, at deflecting that light and, let's say, deflecting more of those photons so that more of the heat stays trapped in here. And another really, really good one is water vapor. So we don't really talk a lot about water vapor because it's usually in our atmosphere. It's kind of part of Earth, right? The water cycle and all that. But the problem is, with the global warming, we're causing more evaporation. We're basically putting more water into the atmosphere, into the air that's not normally there on any given regular, cycle of seasons. And that's actually also a really, really bad greenhouse gas. So all the water that's now in the atmosphere that should be in oceans and lakes that are all drying up, in all of our rivers that we're supposed to be drinking, well, not necessarily supposed to. I won't get into the logistics of syntax. basically that's causing even more problems. So it's what's called a positive feedback loop. So these issues that we're causing are further causing issues that's just going to spiral out of control down the line. So now let's move on to the ice caps. What the hell? What's going on? What's the problem here? So one of the problems with the ice caps is that obviously the big thing is it's full of water, right? And it's full of fresh water, which we will also get to in a moment. But the fact that it's melting and putting more water into the oceans mostly is causing the oceans to rise. Obviously, sea level rise is an issue. Another thing that I believe we're going to get to at some point, well, in another episode. We're probably not going to go over too much of that right here. But yeah, it's going to cause some sea level rise. But we already kind of know that. Another thing that's not as well known, it's not unknown, but it's not as well known, is the reflective property of ice, because ice is white. Not because it's ice, because it's white. Now, for those who know your basic physics, you know that black absorbs light and white reflects it. So when you have, different colors, they're going to have different absorption levels. But we know that black is technically all color because it absorbs all the colors. So technically all the colors are in there if you want to look at it that way. But it's also no color because if colors aren't being reflected out of it, then we're not seeing any color. And then white is technically all color because white's reflected back at level of the spectrum. So that white ice, which is important, reflects back a lot of that sun. It comes down and doesn't impart as much energy, and it gets reflected. So just the fact that the ice exists and is white is helpful, setting aside the fact that it's also keeping all our oceans from overflowing. There's another problem that isn't talked about much. I've seen a few things about it. We'll probably have an episode. I'll do more on this, is algae. There is an algae that grows and changes the color of large patches of ice, and it is starting to become a problem because, as I just mentioned, white ice is reflective. So it's important to have the ice. It's also important for that ice to be white. So the more color change that happens because of this algae, the less reflective even the ice that we have left is, which means it's actually also going to absorb more of the light instead of reflect it, which also causes it to heat up quicker. So that's an issue that's happening, which means we get into this positive feedback loop again. The things that are happening are causing the things that make it happen more. So the water cycle. So again, we're putting more water into the atmosphere. Another obvious problem would be flooding, right? So we've seen a lot of that lately, especially in places where it's like the middle of the desert. Like it doesn't flood or snow or hail or anything there. And now it is, for whatever reason. And that reason, of course, is global climate change. It's not just about the warming. The warming is causing everything to happen. But just because the globe is generally warming doesn't mean every single place warms equally, that you'll never see snow and stuff again. That's not how it works. But the issue here is that the water is going up and it's coming down, and yes, it's flooding. With the water being up in the atmosphere, coming down, flooding is obviously an issue. But on top of the flooding, one of the issues is agriculture, because the way that we do the agriculture is pesticides, obviously, those are a problem. The other problem is something that is really just helpful to plants, and that's nitrogen, because they need nitrogen fixing in order for plants to grow. It's the reason we haven't had another Dust Bowl, is because we've been seeding the ground with nitrogen. So because of that, we've been able to grow in places that normally we wouldn't be able to grow, and for a lot of different seasons. Unfortunately, I believe the statistic is something like 90% of that nitrogen isn't even used by the plants. It's just overkill. And with a lot of this flooding, what's happening is that all of that nitrogen is now being washed into the rivers, into the lakes, and eventually out to the sea. Which has always happened, of course, since we've been doing this nitrogen fixing with just, solid nitrogen, just pouring it out all over the fields. And it's always been a problem. But it's kind of been exacerbated now because the water cycle is intensifying, and there's so much more of that now going in. Where before, the flooding wasn't as bad, we had some going in, but it wasn't, as much as now. Now there's just a ton of it going in. And one of the things that's causing is it's causing the sea levels rising is causing the sea levels to be less salty. And that sounds like, oh, that's great, except the animals in it have adapted to a certain salinity. Their body chemistry depends on it. You can't just make it less salty and have these creatures live. They don't live in fresh water. So you can't just, have animals in water that's less salty because they're not going to survive. So that's a problem. But now that all this nitrogen is going in, it's also changing the chemistry, and it's actually making the waters more acidic. Now the chemistry of the ocean is changing in a lot of major ways. One of them is the fact that this nitrogen causing the ocean to be more acidic is now also throwing everything out of balance because, as we just talked about with the salinity, animals aren't made for that, right? We have some extremophiles that are there, but we're talking like 1 to 3% of all life on this planet, that includes like bacteria and stuff like that, would probably survive in that. The biodiversity would be completely wiped out with only 3% of life being able to handle that kind of thing. And the genetic diversity, well, that's a question for another time, really. But I think the biodiversity is the bigger problem. No more whales, no more tuna, no more things for us to eat unless we exclusively live off not just bacteria, but the bacteria that survives, which we probably won't because they live in acidic environments. They're probably going to be very acidic themselves. They're probably not going to be great for us to eat. So then we go to another problem that's happening, both with global warming, the acidification of the oceans, the less salty, all that kind of stuff. And that problem is going to be coral bleaching. Now, for those who don't understand, coral is, we're not really going to discuss what coral is and blah, blah, blah. The point is, the coral system is, I think, home to like 80% of the life in the ocean is in the coral reefs. And they're not animals who are just hanging out. These aren't, fair weather vacationers or just like they got a week off of work from the deep sea and they just come out and hang out in the corals. These animals live exclusively there. Not all of them. Some of them can go other places, although they're not meant to be other places all the time. Just like salmon, they exist up in certain streams that they always go back to, but then they go to the ocean and they live in the ocean. But they don't just stay in the ocean. That's not how their life cycle works. And if they can't get back to the streams, then they just die and they don't procreate. You will not get more salmon by saying, oh, well, they'll just stay in the ocean, then it's cool. Because they don't do that. They're not prepared to do that. They're not going to do it. So that is an issue there. So the point is that these corals and the coral reefs that are housing this huge amount of biodiversity from the ocean can't just go away and these animals just kind of go to other places. A lot of them are dependent on them and will die off without that coral. The coral dies, they die. We lose a huge biodiversity number of the ocean. And for those who think, okay, well, so we have, 10 less whales out of the, 15 that we have, or whatever the number is. And it's like, no, it doesn't really work that way. These things are interchangeable. A narwhal is not the same as a beluga, is not the same as a gray whale, is not the same as a humpback. You can't just have a few whales and it's cool. Each whale fits within their own food web. So if you get rid of some, you are imbalancing the food web in ways we cannot even come close to imagining. We've seen it happen, especially in smaller environments where it's easier to see the impact, and it is devastating to those environments. So coral bleaching, the corals dying, killing that habitat is really, really a big deal and going to change the oceans in ways we really don't want to see. So let's talk a little bit about the heat itself, because that's one of the big things, right? It's getting hotter. Whenever you're listening to this in 2023, no, sorry, that was last year, 2024, which is the year I'm recording this, in Phoenix, we had some people die because of heat, right? Heat related, more than normal. Like, it happens anyways, but this was way more than normal. So as you can see with what happened in Phoenix, that the heat is going to be a problem. And the heat in Phoenix has always been a problem. This has been especially bad, and it's not getting better next year or the next year. It might fluctuate a little. Maybe next year isn't as bad. It doesn't mean it's not going to be as bad anymore. That just means you get a bit of a break before it gets worse. Eye of the storm kind of a thing. So let's talk about the wet bulb temperature, which is kind of the lowest, not common denominator, but the lowest temperature at which a human being is probably going to die. Not as in 30 below kind of below, but I mean the highest low temperature, if you want to think of it like that. As you're getting into higher and higher temperatures, this is the lowest one at which you would die. So it's an easy scare tactic. It's an easy one for the news to say, hey, look, it's only 98 degrees. Everybody's going to die at the wet bulb temperature, right? I don't remember what the actual wet bulb temperature is that human beings die at. Again, that's something we'll get into in another episode. But the point is that it's pretty low. It's in the 90s somewhere, I believe. So as temperature rises, the first temperature that we reach as we're going up, I believe it's in the 90s somewhere, is a wet bulb temperature. And that's the one that a lot of news people are using right now to scare the heck out of people and say, hey, it's deadly if it gets to this point. This is the wet bulb temperature, and it's somewhere in the 90s. I don't remember exactly what it is. It's something we can get into in a future podcast, not this one at the moment. And the point is that it's one that's being used right now as a scare tactic, and I think it's a bit of a we're crying wolf kind of a thing to get people afraid of something that they don't necessarily need to be afraid of right now, even though the general thing they're trying to get people afraid of is important. So let's just clarify what wet bulb temperature is. Wet bulb temperature is essentially 100% humidity, which is not being in a pool. That's not what it means. The atmosphere has a saturation point. At that saturation point, it's basically rain. When it rains, you've gone past the saturation point. You're not at the saturation point. You've gone past it when you get rain. The saturation point is how much moisture the atmosphere can hold without losing it. So once you start losing it as rain, again, that's past the saturation point. So this is basically high humidity, right? Depending on the humidity will depend on whether you can reach the wet bulb point. The wet bulb temperature is the point at which you cannot get cool. You cannot radiate heat, which is usually done by sweating, and then the air outside evaporates that and cools you off. But you can't get that because your body temperature and the temperature outside is at a bit of an equilibrium, slightly warmer though, so that you actually can't get cooler that way. And then what happens is your body stops cooling and starts heating and building up the heat because it can't release it anymore. It cannot radiate that heat anymore. And then it starts shutting things down and you die. But essentially, the wet bulb is a point at basically 100% humidity, which even the places they're talking about, it's almost never 100% humidity there. Some places definitely are. There's definitely places in the South and in Florida where wet bulb is reached, but a lot of times they're not talking about those places. And even when they are, it's not 100% humidity in a lot of those places. So wet bulb temperature is a thing, and it's definitely scary, but they're using it way more as a scare tactic than I think they really should be. So then there's the shade temperature. That's the temperature most people know. When they give you the temperature, they say it's going to be 106 out. It's not 106 in the middle of the sun. It's 106 in the shade. Why would you measure that? Well, we'll get a little bit into that in the next segment that we're going to talk about. But the point is that this is the temperature that we take. When people measure temperature someplace, that's the temperature they're measuring. It's in the shade. And no, they're not going to tell you that. And say, well, it doesn't say that. It just says 135 in Phoenix today. It is 135 in the shade. And again, we'll talk about that in a second, but that is what they're measuring, whether they say it or not. So all these temperatures are in the middle of the sun, but in shade in the sun, not. So it's not in your house in the shade. It's not in your car. It's not someplace else. It's in the open air, but in the shade in the open air. So that is the normal temperatures that they tell you. And I'm trying to remember, but I think it's 130 something. It might be 140, but I think it's 130 something is the temperature, the non-wet bulb temperature at which your body can no longer radiate heat well enough to cool down. So we're starting to see these temperatures now in places like Phoenix and Death Valley and stuff. We're getting towards these numbers where human beings cannot get cool enough, not outdoors anyways, in the open air. Again, you could go in the AC and everything, right? So then we're going to talk about the next one and why we're telling you that the last temperature is in the shade. And this is what's known as the ground heat temperature. This is not open air walking around. And one of the reasons that they take the temperature in the shade is because when you're walking around not in the shade, you're getting a lot of heat radiating up from the ground. It's not just what's in the air. It's also from the ground. Where in the shade, yes, you're not getting the direct sunlight, but you're also not getting a lot of that ground heat just pouring back up into you. You're getting the temperature of the actual air around as it's flowing through. And that's why it's more accurate in the shade for air temperature, which is what the temperatures they give you is in the weather and that. And they don't give you ground temperature, because ground temperature is going to be way, way hotter. I think that the record that we've recorded of ground temperature is somewhere in the 160s. So you can imagine if they said in your neighborhood, it's going to be 160 out. You'd be like, yeah, wait, what? 100 and what? So yes, 160, I believe. Again, this is something we can get into in a future episode. I've done an episode on this. I just don't remember all the numbers on the old podcast. But the point is that, yeah, it's hot. And it's a more of a danger than people realize, especially when they're out hiking and doing stuff, when they're in the actual direct sunlight, because they're not getting 135 degrees. They're getting that atmospheric temperature plus the ground temperature, which can be 140, 150, 160. It can be extraordinarily hot, especially depending on the surface, like the asphalt. It's going to be way hotter because, again, like we talked about, black absorbs all that energy, and it's going to be warmer. Now imagine you're out and it's, let's say, a warm 80, right? It's pretty warm out. Not so warm that you can't get out and maybe take a jog or something, as long as you drink plenty of fluids and take it easy. But imagine if you did it barefoot. Depending on where you are, of course, mostly it's not going to matter. But different surfaces are going to be different, obviously, like we talked about. The reflective nature of the surface is going to have something to do with how hot that actual surface is. Having said that, you go for a little jog, it's probably going to be either on asphalt or concrete. Concrete does reflect a lot, but it's still going to be real hot, right? Concrete's usually white, but it's not always, especially the more artisan-like stuff. They'll make it nice colors to kind of blend in and not just be just a white sidewalk, right? And those will, of course, absorb more heat than just your average white sidewalk. But a lot of times it's going to be on sidewalk or on asphalt, and those are both going to get pretty warm. And the problem is that a lot of people then who aren't running barefoot are going to take their four-legged friends with them. And they're not getting the 80-degree, warm but handleable with a lot of water. They're walking on the 100-degree, 110-degree, whatever it is, on the surfaces. They get the surface temperature, and people do not think about that. They're like, well, it's just 80. It's not a problem. It is a problem. You're not walking around barefoot, and if you tried it, you would be back inside the house real quick because it is way too hot to walk around barefoot. Well, dogs have pads on their feet. Yes, dogs have pads, but those pads are part of them. They're not a rubber sole that they don't really feel anything. They still feel the heat. It's really, really hot out there, and it is not 80 degrees out, or whatever temperature it says. It's considerably warmer, depending again on the surface and the temperature. It's considerably warmer. They're not going to be very comfortable, but they're obedient animals, and they're doing what they think you want them to do. And so sometimes they're going to burn the hell out of themselves because it makes you happy, because that's just what they're trained to do, not because they're cool with it, bro. All right? So please keep that in mind when you have pets. Don't take them out when it's all that hot. Now, we're going to round things up here and end the podcast here pretty quick. But I want to go over a few things because we're all doom and gloom and all that stuff. But there are certain things that we also want to talk about in preparation for these kinds of things. Now, one of them that I think is probably the most important thing, and it's a doomsday prepper's sort of basic setup, right? It's the most basic thing that they have if they're a real prepper. And that's a go bag or a bug out bag. Now, what this is a bag with supplies, typically for a stay of 48 hours. So you have enough food, enough water for 2 days, essentially, in there. And you have supplies for fire, because if something happens, the electricity might be out, it might be in the middle of winter, you're going to want to be able to make a fire, right? So an axe or hatchet or something like that is a good thing to have, because you might need to chop down some branches in order to get that fire going, gather some kindling, anything like that. There's going to be a lot of supplies that you're going to want in order to put out in this bag. You can prepare. There's websites for this. I've linked to it through my other podcast. We did a whole episode on the bug out bag, but it's something that we're going to talk about again, and it's important to know because it's one of the biggest and easiest things that you can do for yourself and for your family or whatever. But I'm saying by yourself because each person should have a bag. So this would be you're doing it for yourself. Your kids are doing it for themselves. Your wife, everybody's doing it for themselves, obviously, but collectively it's going to be for your family. But everybody should have their own bag. They should not have one bag for you. It's not going to be doable. I don't care how many hikes you've been on. I don't care how many rugged trails and you've carried the supplies for your family. This isn't going to be that. I can explain all the reasons it's not going to be, but if you just realize everybody should have their own bag, we could talk about the reasons why later, and maybe you'll understand, maybe you don't. But trust me, at the time, everybody should have their own bag. And they should always be ready. Not, well, I have the stuff, I just need to put it in the bag. I have the bag, I have the stuff. No, the bag has to be ready. Now, I suggest an extension to that, and that is the vehicle kit. And that is stuff that you can put in if you're able to take your vehicle. If it's a disaster, but you're able to drive somewhere, and no, I don't care if you have a four-wheel drive. If the disaster is a specific disaster, four-wheel drive's not going to help you. Like, you're still not going to be able to get anywhere and do anything, right? So yes, it helps. It's definitely better to have like a four-wheel drive or all-wheel drive in these kinds of situations. But you still might be able to just drive your regular, sedan or something out. But there's an extension, things that you couldn't just carry with you, on a long hike, if trek up a mountain or something, that you can if you're taking your car. So that's an extension that I would suggest and think that's a good idea to keep in mind. The other thing you need to do is come up with escape vectors. Now, a lot of people have, like even in buildings and businesses, they usually have a couple of meeting spots, right? What if there's an active shooter? Obviously, during the shooting, you do this, but afterwards, where do we meet? But then sometimes but if there's a fire, we got to go to this other spot. And if there's this, so they'll have different places to meet depending on what's happening because of the way that you were able to get out of the building, what's going to be most likely safe during any particular event. And that's exactly what you want to look at here. Like, for example, where I am, our biggest threats are earthquake and tsunami. And sometimes they come together, and sometimes the earthquake is far away and it has nothing really to do with us, but the tsunami they send is going to be devastating. Or sometimes we don't really get a tsunami because of the type of earthquake, but the earthquake's going to be devastating, right? So it really depends on what's happening. But if there's a tsunami, then we need to get high up as quickly as possible. Now, we're at a point where we're supposed to be at a safe zone, but that's dependent on a 30-foot wave tsunami. Although anybody who thinks, it's above 30 feet, therefore you're safe from a 30-foot tsunami, has no idea about liquid physics and thermodynamics and, how waves interact with a solid surface. Like, that's not really going to be enough. We're probably not going to get swept out to sea here, but you're probably going to get some flooding, and that's not necessarily something you want to be in either. So the point is that you want to find out what's going to be safe during whatever event that's happening. If it's just an earthquake, you might just want to get into like kind of an open area so a bunch of trees and power lines don't fall on top of your head. If it's a tsunami, you want to get up as high as you can, depending on the size of the tsunami. You don't want to get flooded and have your whole family dragged out into the ocean. If it's a tornado, you probably don't want to be out in the open. You probably don't want to get really high in like a thunderstorm, So there's definitely different scenarios, and you want to go to different places depending on them, and you want plans. One of the biggest reasons is because you have time. That's it's just a huge gift. So take the time, think about these things, change your plans, update them, go, you know what, I realize this is not a good idea. After all, there's going to be way too many people because this is such an obvious place. We need a different place that's not going to be quite as obvious, but going to be safe. Let's do this instead. There's going to be far less people. It's still going to be safe, and we're going to be able to get to where we need to go. Those kinds of things are good to keep in mind and keep thinking about, not like constantly close your eyes, you're thinking about it, wake up. I just mean you're always kind of in the back of your mind looking at things going, is this a safe place? Is that some place we could go? I have this other place, but is this place better? What's the timing? How far away? These kinds of things. You kind of start looking at things a slightly different way. And that's helpful for these escape vectors. So that's a good thing. And let's talk about this other option that the unnamed ghost man has come up with to try to sell people on. And that is, what if instead of fixing our planet and making it better, we tried destroying other planets and making those bad instead? And I'm going to tell you right now, we have people who go to the International Space Station. They cannot stay there the whole time. There are definitely problems with that. We also have people who have been to the moon, right? We have people who are poised to go to Mars. the likelihood of survival on any of these places is extraordinarily low. But with enough money and preparation, yeah, we could probably have limited, and I want to emphasize that, limited stays in some of these places. You couldn't just send somebody to just man this place forever. The physiology of our bodies doesn't really work in these environments. Forget the whole, because we're in space and we're all floaty thing. It's not really going to work out for us long term. So the thought of, well, we'll just leave our home and go to another one, it'll be fine, just get that out of your mind. It's not something that's really going to happen. It's not something today, for sure. It's not something in the future, most likely. By the time we get to any way in which that might be a plausible solution, that we have enough advances in technologies to make something like that happen, we're going to have all the technologies to fix most of the stuff here anyway, so we'll just go there just for fun and for exploration, and not because we have to abandon the planet. If it comes down to that, it's going to happen soon enough that we're not going to have any way of surviving. The best possible scenario would be some sort of seed ship, some sort of world ship that just, hey, we're just in space now. We're a space-dwelling society for the most part. So, we've talked about all the stuff in general, some specifics, laid some groundwork. The next podcast that we do will be a more specific topic, probably based on an event that is happening right there and newsworthy and we're talking about. We've gone over some of the things that we can do to help prepare, some of the things that are, leading us in the wrong direction in general. So that is, I know this is a long preview, right? But that's why this is an episode and the other was a trailer. But yes, this is just a preview of the things we will get a lot more into as basically we take this journey to the end, right? It's like you're going on a train and we're going on a little safari. And we know what's happening at the end because we've done the operator at least has done the safari enough times that he's familiar with what happens. So he could prepare you for, let's say that you were on the Universal Jaws tour and there was like little kids on, and he doesn't want them to get scared. And he's like, hey, at, whatever time, I'll let you know right before Jaws is going to pop up and scare a bunch of people. So I want you to be prepared because I know you're little kids. You might not be able to handle it all that well. Right. What we're talking about is me basically being the train operator. Now I'm leading you through this journey because I can see the end. We can all kind of see it. And I'm just kind of helping to guide us there because we're kind of headed there anyways, right? So I'm just kind of the conductor here that's saying, hey, not all aboard, because we're all aboard already. Let me tell you about this journey that we're all going to be on, whether we like it or not, for the most part. Maybe not, and that would be great if we could swerve and go on another track and end up in a awesome spot instead of this horrific, apocalyptic end. But that's not what the podcast is about. A podcast isn't about giving you hope. It's not about telling you about all the ways we can change things and make them better. It's not about telling you you're a bad person or you're doing all this stuff. It's about just telling you what's happening, why it's happening, and what to expect in the future from that thing, right? So a little bit like a weatherman, I guess, but I think my science might be a little bit better because it's not based on, fractal algorithms that are just, there's so many different variables. It's really hard to predict that kind of thing. And it's not the weather people are stupid. It's just they're trying to predict stuff that's just so complicated. It's not really predictable because things change on a quantum level. They don't just change on a macro. Oh, there's cloud, thus rain, thus it'll be in Denver tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. It is really a quantum level, so they can't always really get it right. And in a way, that's this podcast. for the most part, we're going to get things right, but we're not necessarily always going to get things right. And mostly, we're not even talking about that. I'm just like, hey, this thing happened today, and let's talk about how that's a part of our journey, and not so much the future. Although, again, we will definitely get into some of that and talk about, especially how they're telling us, oh, 2100, maybe 2200, this kind of thing. No, we're going to be more realistic than they are. Some people might say more pessimistic, but if I want to be pessimistic, well, we could definitely do that. But that's not what I want to do. I want to be realistic, but realistic will definitely seem like pessimism, especially compared to what a lot of people are saying about this kind of stuff. So, having said that, so we're going to sign off. I will see you in the next episode. When that comes out, I am not sure. I haven't even thought about what it will be about or anything yet. But we'll see what it is when we get to it. Will we survive our own apocalypse? Only time will tell.